Hello, my name's William Ingram. I'm one of the co-founders of Threads of Life, and I'd like to talk to you today about an understanding of Indonesian textiles, how my experience has been over the years, and how this might help you to deepen your understanding of these textiles, their place in the world, and the culture that they come from. For those of you who don't know about Threads of Life, we are an organization that started in 1998, and since then we now work with over 1,000 weavers on 12 islands in more than 50 communities. And it's about supporting the continuation of traditional production of textiles and the cultures they express. They're all made with natural dyes, and it's about working with women and continuing the livelihoods of these communities in a way that allows them to continue to express their culture and their culture and their community. So I'd like to start where I started, really, where my interest in Indonesian textiles started, which was in Tenganan, in Bali. So I have here a beautiful double ikat cloth from that community. And when I was first being interested in this village and going to see the ceremonies and looking at the textiles there, I had the opportunity to write an article for an in-flight magazine. And one of the people who was helping me in the village told me this story about how everything in life in the village has a pattern. There is structure in the way the houses are laid out. If you go into any house, all the buildings are in the same positions. There is pattern in the textiles. There is pattern in the way a community sits in a meeting, the way they make their offerings and organize their offerings. There's pattern in the way the streets are laid out, in the way the paths run across the landscape. And he talked about how this patterning structure, when you're immersed in it for your whole life, from when you're a child, there can come a point whereby you recognize the same patterns, the same ideas in different parts of the traditional culture. And the way he put it was that from this recognition, there can come sort of an awakening and understanding. And suddenly this person is able to be a medium, or has great charisma as a performer or a dancer or a musician, has a skill to become an orator and a leader of the community. This sounds very sort of new agey and sort of difficult to understand, but I think there's a way to look at this in a different framework. That a community that has lived by a set of shared values for a very long time, this set of values is going to manifest in everything the community does. So there are two different ways of teaching those values. There's what in a Western industrialized culture we might do, which is set up a school and you'd write the values down and we'd learn it by reading, by thinking about it. This tradition has that you live immersed in the lifestyle that is the result of living by those values and that cosmology and that worldview. And that the understanding comes from the embodied experience of living those practices. And this describes, I think, the pedagogy of the way these cultures communicate their traditions from generation to generation. That it is an embodied experience rather than an intellectual one. In Tenganan, they have this tradition whereby the young people move from their home of origin to another home for a period of months to receive sort of an inculcation into these traditions. And so they're not worried. When I asked, aren't you worried about other people learning your secrets? And he says, no, because you really have to live here. You have to have gone through this process. You have to have really been immersed in this practice. People can learn little bits of it, but really, in order to understand its entirety, you've got to have lived it. You've got to be in it. He also talked about the need for when you have understood something in this way, that you don't tell other people, that there's this tradition of secrecy around it as well. And I've thought about this for a long time. From his point of view, it was dangerous to share these ideas. And that danger, from his point of view, was that there would be spiritual consequences from the ancestors. I think there's another way of understanding it too, that if I have made this insight and you are studying in the same way, if I give you prematurely the intellectual understanding, that it gets in the way of your embodied experience. You think you already have the answer, so it doesn't come from muscle memory, it doesn't come from practice. And thinking you understand something actually gets in the way of the learning experience as it's intended to be in these traditions. So I think that's really a framework in which I want to talk about these traditions. So I'm going to move on now from Tenganan and move as a parallel experience to go take this idea a little deeper. We're going to Zumba. This is a large hingi cloth, a men's hip cloth. It has a main center field and reflecting fields above and below it. The structures of this cloth, one way that I've heard it described is that they mirror the structures of a traditional house. The center field is the ridgepole. The neighboring fields represent the loft above the main living space, the space under the house, because they're built up on pillars. And these represent God, the realm of the ancestors, the realm of the living world, the underworld. What you also have when you go more deeply is you see the same idea represented in the layout of the village. The village has like a top, a middle, and a bottom. The landscape in which the village is arranged, from a watershed, the village, down to the sea, this also has this pattern. And so you see over and over again the same pattern represented at different scales. You can go back and look at a loom structure. What we have come to learn is that looking at the motifs and focusing on the motifs and the names and the meanings of particular motifs can be a distraction from the structure of the cloth. And that looking at what are the divisions of the cloth, where do those ideas manifest otherwise in material culture? Look at the different plants that are used. So the wood that's used for the breast beam and the warp beam of the loom, where are those materials also used in the construction of a house? Where in the landscape do they come from? What are the stories associated with this part of the landscape? What are the rituals that have to be performed there? And you'll find different people telling you different things. But what this all comes around to is you have this overlying patterning again, that in some ways, my background is as a mathematician, so I sort of think about this in terms of it being fractal in that it's the same pattern expressed at different scales, and holographic. So an original hologram is a glass plate, an image made with a laser, and it gives you a three-dimensional image, right? When you shatter the glass plate, every fragment includes the whole image, but at lesser resolution. And so here, this is sort of the way I look at material culture, that you see in any part of the material culture the same ideas, the same cosmology, the same way of relating to the world that you will find in any other part. And that it's by putting all those pieces together that the picture becomes more and more clear and more dimensional in terms of an understanding. This textile is made by a Tamurambu Hamu Eti and her household in Rindi. So this is the main royal household in that community. And one of the things she has been experiencing is that she managed to send, she had 5 daughters and no sons, and all of those daughters went to university. They've all married back within the tradition, within the culture, but she sees that they lost a chance to experience this immersive learning process by going away to school. And 1 or 2 of her daughters are really interested in continuing the textile tradition, particularly the dye work. This is an extremely complex process, particularly the red dye process. And so she documented, she'd also been to university, she documented 56 steps in the process of making one of these textiles. And she wanted that documented for her daughters and her granddaughters. She recognized there was a tension between the power of the traditional way of educating and the fact that modern lifestyle doesn't allow that to proceed in the way that it used to. So she asked us to make a video. And so we made this, my wife Jean went over there and made this very detailed video, of which there are 2 versions. There's the one that we share with other people, which is a short one, and there's the great big long version that she has the copy of that she will use as a way of passing on information. So we come to this point where these traditions are at a turning point, a balance point. How does the way of being in the world continue? It's not just about keeping the physical tradition going. It's not just about maintaining the skill set. It's maintaining the way of life that the textile and the skill set are actually expressions of, and without which the textile and that skill set sort of become empty and somewhat meaningless. So how do we engage in a way that helps maintain that and continue it moving forward? I want to go on to one way that these textiles are used in this community. You'll hear a lot about bride wealth and textiles used in the exchange of goods that accompany marriage. And from a royal household in Zumba, you sort of see this in its most extravagant expression. And one of the things that in observing this over time, I sort of have like these 3 points I sort of see. That the exchanges are reciprocal. So I give you a gift, you give me a gift. In this case, the primary gift is the gift of the daughter being given to the family, the clan that she marries into. The reciprocal gift is livestock. The gift that's given in return is textiles. So it's reciprocal, it's iterative, and it's actually asymmetrical. So a bigger gift is returned by a smaller gift, is returned by a smaller gift and a smaller gift. It can also be asymmetrical in that these marriage relationships is women from this community marry into these communities, but it doesn't come back the other way. Women from those communities marry onto another community. And eventually you get to a community where you can marry back here, to the home village. This is sensible in terms of keeping bloodlines apart amongst the small population, but it also comes back to this cosmology. So these 3 ideas, iteration, reciprocity and asymmetry, are ideas I want to carry forward in terms of what we're looking at here. I'd like to move across the sea from Zumba a little and come over to the island of Lambata and the village of La Malera. This is actually where we started Threads of Life. It started out during the economic crisis of 1997, 1998, on the porch of the school teacher, Ben Ebang, he also ran a homestay, that if you'd been there at that time, you would have known it was one of the places to stay. And we met there with a group of 12 weavers, and they were talking about how their culture was disappearing and this tradition was disappearing. And we had the idea of commissioning them to continue to make these beautiful textiles. This is actually one of the pieces from that first round of purchasing. At the time, we were somewhat naive. We thought that keeping the technique alive, having women be able to continue to make them and having the economic framework was enough to keep it going forward. In some ways, what I'm telling you today is what we've learned since that shows the deeper understanding we've come to over time. But these pieces are also used as wedding exchange textiles, given by the bride's family to the groom's family. And so this is one of the things that a study of Indonesian textiles you come across over and over again, the use of textiles in marriage rituals. The other thing that La Malera is also famous for is its whaling. Now it's been a controversial part of my relationship to this village all along. I initially didn't even want to go to the village because of its practice of whaling. But over time, I've become a little less ambiguous about my relationship to that. And I want to tell you one story about that has given me some insight and relates to the arc of the story I want to tell today. In the 1990s, this is something we heard rather than saw, but we were told about a conflict within the village between the seafaring clans and the landowning clans. So there are many clans in the village, and the boats that are lined up on the beach belong to the clans that go and do the sea hunting. And they migrated to the community many hundreds of years ago and became tenants of the community that was already there. So in the 1990s, there was conflict between these two clans over the use of a particular piece of land. And the landowning clans went up to the ritual site on the volcano above the village. There is a ritual site where each year a ceremony is performed to the ancestors, to the whales at the opening of the whaling season, sort of inviting the whales to come, asking permission to take them, asking them to give themselves to the community. And so the land-bearing clans went up to this place and did a ceremony to ask the whales not to come. And I don't know whether the catch decreased to zero, but it significantly diminished. And this went on for many months. It might even been as much as a year. And eventually the seafaring clans relented, accepted that the land belonged to the land-bearing clans. And they went up, undid their ceremony, and the whales started to show up again. Now we can understand this in many ways. We could say it's complete coincidence. We could talk about it in very superstitious terms. Or we could perhaps suspend our disbelief and we could cross the bridge into a relationship to this culture that allows this to be the way the world is, and accept that there is a relationship, a connection between these people and these animals, and that it involves the giving and taking of this life in the way that this happens in their sea hunting. So, might be a little bit of a controversial point of view, but I just want to place that as a framework there. One of the things that sort of put me into a mind to accept this story was an experience I had with Pak Ben once he died of malaria. So Pung, who is a Balinese man who's our co-founder, Madi Madawarta, of Threads of Life, we were in eastern Indonesia after he had died and went to visit his family home. And his wife Yudis, on the day we arrived, we said, can we go to Ben's grave? And so we went in the dark up to the graveyard, and it's sort of like all the graves are above ground because the ground is so rocky. So we went to his tomb and we brought candles. It's Catholic on the outside, looks very Catholic. And we quietly said our prayers. The next day what we were doing is we were doing some documentation of their dye processes. So they were doing their dye work and we were recording what they were doing. We started in the morning, and by about 12 o'clock, Pung and I were both feeling really rotten. Both had nausea, both were dizzy, both felt sick. They noticed this and said, you're not feeling very well. Why don't you go and have a lie down? So these are these houses that are right on the beach. They've got tin roofs. They're right in the baking sun. It's incredibly hot inside. You wouldn't think it's the place you'd go to take a nap in the middle of the day. They took us in. I was given this little pallet bed. I'm very tall, I'm over 2 meters tall, and this must have been like 1.5 meters long, and the mattress was kapok, and it had probably been used for like 50 years, and it was like sleeping on a rock. But I curled up there, immediately fell asleep. So did Pong. When I woke up, I looked across the room to him, and he was just waking up as well. "You all right?" "Yeah." I'm like, "Oh." "Yeah, we're both feeling much better." We went outside. They were all, "Are you better now? Okay, we'll carry on." So we carried on with the work until we finished. On our way home up the hill with Ben's wife, Judith, she stopped us when there were nowhere else around and turned to us. And she didn't quite put it like this. She's much more polite like this, but it felt like this. She said, "What did you do up at the grave last night?" Pong and I hadn't talked about what we were going to do. We hadn't talked about what we had done since we'd been up there. But we both, turns out, we'd both done the same thing that you would do in an ancestral shrine here in Bali. We'd gone to the shrine of the ancestors here, and we'd asked Ben to help us in our work with the community group that he started, with this weavers group. And Judith shook her head and said, "We thought you'd done something stupid like that. Leave the dead where they are. Don't go calling them back. We could see that Ben was there amongst us. We could see he was giving you problems. So he put you to bed and did a ceremony to send him away again, back to where he belongs. Don't do it again." So I said she was much politer than that, but that was the emotional impact of what she said. So this was one of my early experiences of, there's more here than meets the eye. There's more here than my frame of reference for my culture is going to allow me to understand. How do I go deeper into this? So this is a beautiful cloth from Anguilla in the Ende Regency of Flores. This area has one of the most complex natural dye processes. To produce this brown red takes an extraordinary amount of time, an extraordinary amount of dye materials, and a great deal of work and knowledge. The rituals are actually around the blue process, which produces the background color, which is overdyed with the red. And one of the dyers I know, she's shown us some of her rituals, but she says, "Don't tell other people." And the rituals weren't around the dye pot, they were around the place where the dye is done. So it was more about place, it was relationship to space and environment than it was particularly to process. This was something quite new to me when she started talking about this, because I had related to the textiles of this area largely through what you see in this cloth, which is Indian trade textiles. So if you know the patola textiles, the double ikat silk textiles from India that were used as barter goods during the spice trade period, you'll see this cloth very strongly representing those patola patterns. For myself, this was a great distraction to my understanding of the culture, because I was looking at these textiles in terms of how they were influenced by the outside world, how this culture was influenced by the outside world. It sort of fitted with there was confirmation bias. I'm looking from the outside world. So I'm seeing things that confirm the relationship of the outside to these communities. And in some ways, it got in the way of my seeing the agency of these cultures within their own sphere. And so academics have done an awful lot of work on this. I was recently reviewing Joanna Bachman's work on the Biboki textiles and the influence of patola textiles there. And academia certainly sees the depth of this. But as a neophyte coming into relationship to these textiles, I did get caught up in the trade influences. And it got in the way of me seeing, taking a deeper relationship to these cloths. So this is something for someone coming new to these cloths that I would suggest. Understand the trade relationships, but don't get stuck in that. There's much more here that can be seen and understood. One thing more I want to say about these Ende textiles is that our relationship to the dye work here led us into a relationship to a particular plant. So making the red dye work here, making the red dye affixed to the cotton, is this complex mordanting process. And a component of that mordanting process is a plant that's an aluminium hyperaccumulator. So you need a metallic iron to make these dyes affixed to cotton. And certain plants have been the traditional sources of that aluminium. And one of them is Symplochus cochinensis, which is a tree, the leaves, the bark, the wood of which contain this aluminium. Traditionally, the way this is sold is a bunch of leaves wrapped in a strip of bark, and the bark dries and folds around the leaves and creates this bundle, which is sellable. In the early 2000s, when we were doing work with these communities, and they were complaining about the lack of supply of this dye plant. Where is it? What is it? Can we grow it at home? We started doing research into this and worked out what the plant was and started looking for where it was. And one of the main, most accessible intact forests that still has Symplochus in it is the one that's right along the spine of Flores, sort of from Bajawa right out to the eastern end, the Kembang Boleng forest. And from one of the communities we were working with in Ende, in Ndona, which is right near Ende, they had marriage relationships up into a forest community where this was growing. And so with help of the forestry department, we set up women's groups to go into the forest and collect the fallen leaves. We'd taken samples and sent them off to Kew Gardens Jodrell lab, and they had done the analysis, and a beautiful result. They found that the highest aluminium content is in the fallen leaves. So you just go into the forest and pick them up. We worked out how to pay for it so that it was at least as good an income as what they're making from coffee production, cultivation. And we looked at how much leaf matter there actually was. It's hundreds of tons a year. So taking 1 ton a year out of the forest is not going to have an impact on the ecosystem there. And we started reselling this across the network. It basically reestablishes an old trade relationship and expands it. Traditionally, this trade came from Alor and from what's now a national park in Zumba, where they're not allowed to go in. The problem is taking the bark, right? When you take the bark, you kill the tree. And so this is why the forestry department that's concerned with keeping these forest reserves is not keen on people going in and taking the Symplochus anymore. But in Ende, where the tradition has only ever been to take the fallen leaves, it's a great way to support the tradition and continue it elsewhere. So we now work with trading this Symplochus to other communities, and we even sell it to dyers around the world as well. So here, going from looking at it from the outside, looking at it from the inside, allowed us to expand our relationship and our support for the tradition as well. So now I'd like to go across to Timor. And the motif on this cloth from Malacca, which is the Atoni Lafaik. Atoni is a person, an ancestor, and Lafaik is a crocodile. So only certain women can weave this motif. You have to make an offering of betel nut before you start the work. You have to take some of the warp threads back to the clan house when you finish the work. The motif is considered to be alive, as it were, particularly the ancestor, but the crocodile as well. And there is a relationship to the crocodile as an ancestor. This spun my head for years. How can an ancestor be a crocodile? How can a crocodile be an ancestor? An insight into this came again from that community I was just talking about in Ndona, above Ndona, in Flores, where we collect the Symplochus from. In order to work in that forest, we didn't just have to get permission from the forestry department, we had to get it from the traditional ritual leader of the community. And he was very supportive. And one day I was asking him, I said, you talk about the ancestors, where are they? And he said, they're in the trees, they're in the rocks, they're in the river, they're in the mountain. There's a particular place in the forest, which is sort of this ritual reserve. You can't talk about it. We learned where it was because we were told we couldn't go there. You can't photograph it, you can't look at it, you certainly can't go there. And so what happens? It's like when you die, you go into the tree, the rock, the landscape. And so there's this feeling that there isn't this separation between people and nature. And there's this fluid flow of life that is observed when you live in nature as life moving from one expression, one manifestation to the other, into human form, and from human form back into another form as well. And so in this way, the idea that a crocodile could be an ancestor starts to make sense. When there is this fluid relationship where life is what we are all part of, rather than atomizing it into human life, tree life, animal life. It's just the flow of life that we are participating in. For these communities in Timor, they have a sacred spring, they have a sacred rock, they have a sacred house, and there's an animal that could be described as a totem, but is also related to as an ancestor, or it's a plant. For example, in Boti, which is a village we've worked with quite a lot, the clans there have birds as totems, and the birds live in the forest, and therefore the forest around, at least around the village, is preserved. You can't cut down the trees because they're the homes of the plants, the birds, and those plants are therefore kept within the landscape. And that relationship continues to deepen and benefit everyone. A way to sort of think about this, I've thought about, it's like, so how does the motif fit into this? That the motif is regarded in the same way that the physical crocodile is. So there are crocodiles in these landscapes. So estuarine crocodiles like you get in Northern Territory, Australia. Big, 4 meter, 3/4 of a ton, enormous predators. And so I sort of think about it as, it's like an iceberg. So on the surface, it might appear that there are 3 different icebergs, but when you go underneath, there's actually one iceberg emerging in 3 different places. That there is an underlying crocodileness that manifests in the actual animal, in the motif, in the relationship to the ancestors, in the crocodile nature we might find within our own selves at different parts of our lifetime. And so it's going into this seen and unseen world. This is another theme you find all across the archipelago, that the unseen world and the seen world mirror each other, and the relationship can move back and forth, the power can move back and forth between these 2 realms. So that's perhaps another way to start looking at these textiles. I want to move across now to Savo. And I want to start by referencing the work of Genevieve Dugan, who many of you listening will know about, and her talk about memoryscape. In her writing, she talks about the land of Savo, the island where this is from, as a memoryscape, and how the growth structure of plants and the structure of buildings become a mnemonic, a source of a reminder that helps people memorize their incredibly complex genealogies. Genevieve talks about women being able to recite their maternal lineage back through tens of generations. It connects mythical time to historical time. It sets order in social precedents and relationships, and that in turn defines the way that people relate to the land and the way people get allocated land and claim use of land for growing food. And if you read this work, look at the complexity. When you visit Savo and you see and hear about this complexity on this very dry island, it sort of like brings to mind why this incredible complexity developed. What is it that has provoked this deep complexity in the human relationships? And perhaps it is that the relationship with the more than human part of the landscape there, the relationship to the other species, the relationship to the reef, when you can go onto the reef, when you can't go onto the reef, different parts of the landscape, when you can use certain plants, when you can't use certain plants, that the complexity of the human relationship reflects the complexity of the relationship to the more than human world. That was necessary in order to be able to survive in such a difficult environment. That the human social structure actually mirrors the complexity of the landscape itself and the way people have to relate to it. And so, again, I think this deepens the picture of what we are looking at here. That an ongoing theme I'm going to come back to is this is about relatedness. Over and over again, I come back to this being about how to develop, maintain, understand the relationship between people and the place in which they're living. So this brings me to something of a personal experience I want to talk about, which is embodied by this little thing. If you come to Bali, you've seen these all over the place. This is a canang, the daily offering that is placed in shrines, or you'll see it on the ground. So let me put it down over here. When my wife Jean and I were first living in Bali, we built a house here. And our landlord and friend to this day, Pak Wayan Sudarta, we call Darta, Darta came to the house once we finished building it. It's a very simple house. And he said, okay, now that you have built this house and you're living here, you have to take proper relationship to where you're living. And it's like, okay, what does that mean? He says, you need to start doing offerings. You're not doing all the offerings. This is still our land. This is still our place. So we'll do the daily offerings. But you need to take a relationship to where you are. And so on the full moon, on the new moon, on Kajim Kliwon, which is a date that comes up in the Balinese calendar every 15 days, but other high points in the calendar, you need to do some offerings as well. Either one of you can do that. But you, as a family, take a relationship to this place. And so I remember saying to Data, but what do we do? How do we do that? What are the prayers? At this shrine, what do you say? At that shrine, at the well, what do you say? And he said, he actually mimed it. He said, you've seen us doing this. Just go and do it. And so that was the way I started. It's like, okay, now I'm at the front gate. What do I say here? It was like, okay, as I've talked before, suspend my disbelief. If there were a spirit or a deity of this gate, what would I say to it? So it's all right, well, I'd like you to let the nice people in, keep the bad people out. It'd be very good and effective at doing that. So this was sort of how the practice developed. And the measure of success, because I had no external reference for that, was how it felt. Did it feel congruous? Did it feel congruent with the space? It also evolved over time, because even when it did feel right, I never exactly remember what I said last time. So it evolves over time. And it becomes, as I've talked about earlier, this is where this idea comes from, this embodied practice. Doing something over and over again. The interesting part of this is that Data's wife, Suti, was an elementary school teacher of Hindu religion. So she had a totally different relationship to this. She said, this shrine is to this deity and this is the mantra that you say. and this place is for this deity, and this is what you pray there. So she came from the formalized Bali Hindu religion that has happened since the formation of the Indonesian Republic, and communicating a way that you have to do this, an orthodoxy. And Datta was, and I've canvassed people since this, he was reciting the older way, which any daughter, mostly daughters, but boys as well, you learn just by following your mum around, and eventually there's a day when she can't do it, and so then you pick it up, your turn to go and do it. And no one's told you what to do, you just go out and start doing the offerings yourself, and discover for yourself what your relationship to this place is through the practice, and through the repetition of just doing it over and over and over again. And one of the things that comes back to the theme I mentioned earlier about it being reciprocal, iterative, and asymmetrical is that ultimately I started to see what I'm doing here is I'm honoring the natural world around me with something I have taken from the natural world. I'm giving thanks for what I've been given by taking something to give back. It's sort of like a Zen koan. You know, what sound does one hand make? That sort of classic representation of the Japanese koan. And it just like works in your body, in your psyche over time, opening up the practice for you just by doing it. And again, it's like what I was told in Tenganan. Asking someone else what it is disrupts my practice. When I'm told what it should be, then my own experience of it becomes different. I've got the little voice in my head saying, you're not doing it right, you should be doing it this way. And that disrupts that whole embodied, basically emotional engagement with what is happening in the world around me. And so that's what this has to do with this story that I'm talking about here. Another long-term friendship colleague that we have. This is the one exception we have from our work, the work of the community's work with all being natural dyes. Nia and Ismoyo of Brahmatirtasari are doing natural dye work, but this is one of their pieces that they do very carefully with synthetic dyes, making sure they're very careful about the environment. But I'm bringing this up here in this story, one, because I just want to show off this beautiful piece, but two, because Ismoyo has some interesting insights on this conversation. One of the ones I like is he describes the difference between Western art and the art in his tradition. So he talks about going to the ocean. So he says, so a Western artist goes to the ocean with a block of sketch paper and will sketch over and over and over and over, seeking to let go of what is superfluous and identify what is essential about the ocean that they are encountering in order to bring that essence out in their artwork. Ismoyo says the way I would do it from my tradition is I would go to the coast, go to the beach with one piece of paper, and I would put it down and I would dive into the ocean, and I would be in the ocean until I embody the ocean, until I become one with the ocean. And then I will come out and I will be the ocean painting itself. And I only need one piece of paper to do that. The work is done in the ocean. The work is not done on the paper. And this seems to me, frames this conversation beautifully. It's the difference between looking at from afar and trying to cross the bridge into connection and relatedness to these cultures and these societies that we engage with when we look at, when we appreciate, when we engage with the material culture as it's represented in these textiles. So this is a piece from a set of communities we're very proud to be working with in Sulawesi, in the the region inland from Mamuju. This is the part of the Toraja cultural groups, the Karatau Toraja. And this was an area that when Maripun, who I mentioned was our partner, first started going into this area, it's incredibly difficult to get to. It's basically a roadless region. It takes a couple of days of off-road travel to get into here. And so the community is incredibly self-reliant. And they were making these beautiful textiles. But traders who would come in at the end of the dry season and would drive prices down when people really needed money for food. And the result was quality went down and down and down. So going there and building relationship, visiting over and over again, as we have to do with all of these communities, it generally takes us 2 or 3 years in visiting a community to get the trust of people for them to start investing in making high quality textiles for us. They have been betrayed so often by the market and by the whole development process that you really have to build a relationship of trust before someone will take a risk and make a really beautiful piece for you, trusting that you'll actually come back and buy it. They'll invest that time. And then when that one person has succeeded, then there'll be others willing to come on. And eventually you end up with a whole group of women who you're working with, and we have a relationship with trust with, that we have to maintain and they have to maintain. We keep this relatedness going. And one of the great successes of that is the work that Pung did and continues to do in the Toraja region, where they produce these textiles. The motif here is called an ulu karwa, and it relates to ancestral priests, the group of priests that oversee traditional life, and that they also represent the ancestors of this area as well. And so I'm wanting to make my sort of final point here, which is about relatedness, that underneath all of what I've been talking about is this concept of relatedness. There is a Native American academic, an ecologist who I've been reading. His name's Kyle White. And he talks about the climate change movement says that we're approaching tipping points in terms of glacier melting, in terms of methane out of the Arctic. We can name those tipping points that we read about in the media. He says, from his point of view, from his culture's point of view, the tipping point was far earlier. The tipping point was the loss of relatedness. That meant that we lost our interactive capacity with the species around us, with the people around us. He looks at the impasse at international level, at the Paris Accords, at the Conference of Parties that happens every year on climate change, and he sees that as evidence of that lack of relatedness. And so that crisis is the one that these indigenous traditions can flag for us. That these other challenges that we're facing as a global society are informed by the wisdom of these traditions, and that by us taking a different relationship to these traditions and seeking to learn from them in a new way, we might bring back something that informs the way we relate to each other, we relate to the non-human species around us, the way we relate to the world, and start to address some of the major challenges that we're all facing. I'm not talking about cultural appropriation here. I'm not saying that we all become Timor animist or Balinese Hindu. But I am saying that there are lessons, there are ways that these cultures look at the world that can be very useful in the way that we're moving forward. In some ways, I can't really see how we will go forward without embracing a new relationship to the world that in some way is descended from these ideas. It's what our ancestors carried for 250,000 years, their view of the world. Are we really willing to say that everything we've learned since the Renaissance, since the scientific revolution, is all we'll ever need to know as humanity goes forward? I think that shows some hubris, and I think that we need to listen to these traditions. And I think that these textile arts give us a huge opportunity when we go to the villages where they're made, where we can come into relationship with the makers, with the custodians of these traditions. If we go with some humility and go with an open mind and an open heart, we can receive incredible gifts, far beyond the value. Those gifts are what make these textiles, when we do buy them from the makers and take them home, they what bring these pieces alive in our homes and in our hearts. And so this is what I want to invite you to do, is to take this relationship, to try and see how you can cross the bridge into a different relationship with these traditions and these cultures. And yes, support these communities economically, buy their textiles. And yes, there's a little plug for my business as well. One way you can do that is by visiting our website and looking at our online gallery. But beyond that, when the world opens up again and you can continue to travel, see if there's a different way, a deeper way that you can relate to these people, to these traditions. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope this brings benefit to you and these communities as we move forward. Thank you very much.